Welcome to the closing plenary for IWAC's 15th International Conference. We're really happy. I have to admit, this week has gone by a lot more quickly than I thought it would. And I'm really delighted to see so many people turning out for this closing plenary. This is great. I'd like to ask Caleb Gonzalez, one of our associate directors, to introduce our plenary speakers.
Thanks, Mike. And hi, everyone. I will introduce our plenary speakers for the last session of this conference as we look at WAC and the future tense. I'll go ahead and begin with El Harahap, our first speaker, and then I will introduce Federico Navarro, and then I will end with Elisa Russell. El Harahap is a lecturer in the University of Oklahoma's expository writing program, currently exploring WAC, WID, and learning community opportunities with various campus communities, academic and otherwise. His research, service, and teaching lie at the intersections of diversity, equity, and inclusion issues. And WAC, WID, writing centers, and writing program administration writing ecologies. He co-founded the WAC Go, is outgoing managing editor of the journal Exchanges, and currently serves on the WAC Clearinghouse and Council of Writing Program Administrator boards. His current favorite classes to teach usually involve helping students bring their specialized discourses into public spheres and the socio-political world. Our next speaker will be Federico Navarro. Federico Navarro has a PhD in linguistics. He is an associate professor at the Institute of Education Sciences at the Universidad de O'Higgins in Chile. He is the principal investigator of 2 state-funded research projects on writing and learning in higher education, and co-investigator of a state-funded project on writing across history. He is the president of the Latin American Association of Writing Studies in Higher Education and Professional Contexts, which is called ALES. He is founding member of the Association for Writing Across the Curriculum and editor of International Exchanges on the Study of Writing series. He has presented his research in more than 70 conventions. He has published more than 100 scientific papers on writing studies, discourse studies, and systemic functional linguistics, including the Spanish translation of the reference guide to writing across the curriculum. And Elisa Russell. Elisa Russell is entering her 2nd year as an assistant professor of English in the writing program at Wake Forest University. Her research and teaching interests are centered in rhetorical genre studies, public writing, and writing across the curriculum, and she especially focuses on how to increase community access through writing and writing innovations. For example, she recently completed an ethnographic study of a Parks and Recreation department to uncover how their written genres included and excluded people from the actions of their local government. In the writing program at Wake Forest, Elisa teaches courses in first-year writing and in an interdisciplinary writing minor, and she is also co-developing a WAC program. Elisa's current WAC research focuses on vertical scaffolding from first-year writing through upper-level writing courses, and she also explores how her findings about the way writing works in non-academic spaces might be developed in the WID classroom. Elisa co-founded the WAC graduate organization, for which she and her co-founders just won the Early Career Contributions to the Field Award. This work especially led to a research interest in mentorship practices within academia and as a part of writing development. Elisa currently serves as chair of the WAC Summer Institute Committee for AWAC, the Association for Writing Across the Curriculum, which is currently organizing a special fall institute that will take place in Albuquerque, New Mexico from October 20th to the 23rd. And additionally, Elisa's work has appeared in journals such as Composition Forum, the WAC Journal, Across the Disciplines, and Pedagogy. A warm welcome to all of our speakers for today's plenary session.
And so you've heard our bios. We all come from very different positionalities and thus have different perspectives. We've been tasked with looking toward the future of WAC, but we can only do this through our own lenses. So we're going to explore three major concepts that we think should drive the future of WAC, but we'll each present our take on them: coloniality, equity, and sustainability. Decolonial studies have pointed out that modern-day coloniality is not so much a matter of military and material colonialism of certain specific regions by foreign invaders, but a more subtle and pervasive epistemological and symbolic enterprise, a Eurocentric and US-centric, rational modern, racially oriented, English-dependent, center to periphery, global north to global south paradigm of knowledge-making, beliefs, symbols, and ways of communication. By the way, you can see on your screen the North-South divide proposed by Willy Brandt in the 1980s and now not totally up to date. So modern-day coloniality is, as Maldonado Torres put it, a coloniality of knowledge. The geopolitical location of scholars, texts, and languages impacts the politics of academic knowledge production. Interestingly, this means that Northern English-based knowledge production is located in a supposedly zero point of observation, as Castro Gomez calls it, or an unmarked locality, as noted by Lillis and Curry, which produces seemingly universal claims. This is pretty much the case within writing studies and composition. Let me quote Horner and colleagues. The field operates with a tacit assumption that scholarship is located, produced, found, and circulated in English medium, US-centric publications only. And the field implicitly circulates a certain narrative, and I'm quoting Donahue here, an American narrative of unique knowledge, expertise, and ownership of writing instruction and writing research with universal courses, sovereign philosophies and pedagogies, and agreed on language requirements. Let me share some data with you to illustrate this point. I will refer to some of the most prestigious and influential journals in writing studies, rhetoric and composition, and WAC. Written Communication, for instance, claims to be an international multidisciplinary journal that publishes theory and research in writing. However, 73.2% of the authors published in the journal between 2016 and 2018 are based in Central English-speaking countries, namely the US, the UK, Canada, Australia, Hong Kong, New Zealand, and Ireland. And 100% of the papers were published in English. Moreover, 90.5% of the members of the editorial board are based in the same Central English-speaking countries. Not very international, to tell you the truth. As you can see, other journals also show this international scope, either implicitly or explicitly, but the profile of authors and board members is not very international. We find the same situation in across the disciplines, with 100% of authors of articles published only in English between 2016 and 2018 based in the US and Canada. And on the editorial review board, there's only one member based outside the US in a non-English speaking country, namely Sweden, although you know that everybody speaks English everywhere in Sweden. So the future of WAC could involve considering non-English speaking literature and traditions to promote North-South research collaborations and exchanges like this one. Thanks, Mike Palquist, for inviting us to engage in this dialogue. It could also actively contest historically unequal global configurations and hierarchies, identify colonial dynamics, account for gaps in local and global research, and promote real reciprocity between regions. Mainstream journals and publishing companies could effectively democratize international participation and publish in different languages. They could genuinely question the limitations of mainstream knowledge, especially considering their declared or implicit international universal reach. As you can see on the screen, I believe that the WAC Clearinghouse book collections, which have consistently published the work of scholars from many places, and more recently in languages other than English, are pushing the boundaries in this regard.
Okay, just a quick disclaimer that what we're charged with to talk about the future of WAC is a huge cross to bear. And we don't have a crystal ball, but when the three of us discussed what we want to say, it was these three terms, tropes, that kept coming up. Perhaps not in the predictive, but in the aspirational. So they're very big words and concepts, and we have no delusions that we can be comprehensive with them. So what we're doing today is just to stimulate you about the future of WAC, and we hope you can share your own imaginations and visions in helping us synthesize during the Q&A afterward. All right. So thank you, Federico. On the idea of coloniality, I want to start with a land acknowledgement. I'm speaking from Central Oklahoma, the traditional home of the Caddo Creek, Muskogee, and Seminole nations and the Wichita tribes, as well as the traditional migration and trade routes of the Apache, Comanche, Kiowa, and Osage nations, lands which continue to be colonized to this day. I'm also speaking from the figurative lands of rhetoric, composition, and writing studies, which have been and continue to be colonized by the aestheticism of belles lettres and the field of literature. I've spent the last week or so glossing over any patterns in WACWID literatures, and just as a very broad general observation, I'm noticing that corresponding with MacLeod et al.'s WAC for the New Millennium and the conception of across the disciplines in the early aughts, we more and more are diverging from our closest sibling fields, writing program administration and writing center work, by embracing empiricism. And when we don't have numbers, I also noticed that we love using surrogate charts and graphs and tables. So I'm not sure at this point if we're creating and preserving our own culture, or if we're actually just capitulating to the dominant colonial forces of STEM-oriented academia, with its culture of big data, impact factors, and other epistemological quantifications. And I also wonder if there's some kind of Vygotskian proximal development happening here, wherein we're so much in service to STEM fields that we end up absorbing or adopting their epistemologies. So I'm thinking of coloniality in a few different ways here. First, the more literal global historical events, and how one lingering consequence is that English has become a sort of de facto lingua franca of the world, including within exchanges of a global academics, which Federico explored in more depth. And the other, more figurative, is the territoriality of academic disciplines. More specifically then, I'm thinking of the ways colonial processes work in our institutional WACWID initiatives. I'm not the first to suggest this metaphor. I've heard it for years, particularly coming out of Writing Center community and work, and including a few times at this conference over the past few days. If we look at, sorry, Elisa, can you go back one, please? Thank you. Oh. If we look at various institutional units, whether that's content units with academic disciplines or programs or administrative units, these all can be considered imagined communities, and we can conceptualize them using imagined geographies. I'm borrowing terms here from Benedict Anderson and Edward Said, respectively, who look specifically at the formation of nation states, sometimes naturally, sometimes forcibly, around shared or imposed cultural and political values. So if we imagine various campus units that WACWID has to work with as these imagined communities and imagined geographies, we can start to identify clusters or continents, if you will. We can then ask questions like, what are the dominant cultures in this world? And each institution is its own world. What have been the sordid socio-political and intercultural histories within and between campus communities that affect their inter-unit dynamics? And how can we then use these institutional histories and policies to our advantage? And I don't necessarily mean in a malign way. So it's a kind of power and relational mapping to inform our WAC outreach, advocacy, and decision-making. So I'm gonna leave the metaphor there for now, but we'll pick it up again throughout the other two keywords.
Yeah, so as you can see, as we're demonstrating for you, we're not really presenting this talk as a coherent whole, but in staccato, in chorus. A lot of our ideas align, some of them divide, others perhaps even contradict. This is on purpose. We want to draw out the tensions between how all of us approach these ideas of coloniality, equity, and sustainability very differently based on our own positionalities, so that we're collectively creating a polyphonic WAC of the future. So on coloniality then, Al's ideas of imagined geographies has really got me thinking about WAC as a connector. I believe this image of a bridge is AWAC's proposed logos, or one of their proposed logos, both to note the connecting work that AWAC does as an organization, but also the connecting work that WAC does in general. We connect faculty across the disciplines to one another. We connect disciplinary writing to research and principles in writing studies. We connect writing happening inside the academy to writing happening beyond the academy. This connective work, I think, is possible because of the connections we even make within our field, right? Constantly refreshing and brainstorming the connections between theory and practice, research and administration, principles and pedagogy. I further see WAC as this generative hub across many cross-sections within writing studies, right? Writing assessment, transfer, genre studies, lifespan writing, media studies, problem-based learning. So much WAC work draws on and benefits from these various areas. But then WAC also provides the space to put these areas into conversation. So David Russell, no relation, by the way, just a lot of admiration, especially flowing from me to him, even recently described technical and professional writing and first year of writing as two inextricably linked poles of transfer research with WAC-WID in the middle. So the middle, the connective tissue, interstitial. My question then is, how does WAC act as a conduit, a generative middle space, without subsuming or claiming everything as our own? But then on the flip side, how does WAC maintain its visibility and identity amongst all of these connections so that we can keep making them? So I am going into my second year as faculty, hired to lead WAC initiatives, not a WAC director because we don't have a WAC program yet, that doesn't exist. And I'm facing a lot of those just really classic issues for someone starting up a WAC program, right? I want buy-in from a variety of stakeholders across campus. I'm trying to learn the various campus initiatives and offices I can partner with and hook our mission into. I'm working with top-down mandates while trying to cultivate a bottoms-up approach. Okay, so many people have written on all of these things. A lot of people in this Zoom room, I've read a lot of it, and it's all so good. But these questions I'm asking about WAC as a connector and what that means in terms of coloniality are palpable, even in these very kind of old hat basic WAC operations level. So one thought toward the future of WAC is wrestling with this question of what does it really mean to invite ourselves, physically or metaphorically, into others' disciplinary classrooms, into other fields? What are we inviting in turn? In other words, how do we steep our work as connectors in collaboration and reciprocity? Is it possible to offer all we can and receive all we can? To use our position as connector to constantly recreate our identities as a field, as program, as scholars?
Thank you, Elisa. So our second driving concept is equity. But before I get into that, I want to start by sharing with you all that it has been mentally and emotionally draining to be at conferences like IWAC, in organizations like AWAC, and adjacent ones like in Writing Center and WPA communities, wherein I consistently find myself in spaces and moments where I'm one of only a very few non-white people, sometimes the lone single one among 20, 50, or in today's case, upward of 100 people. At a physical conference, I can at least sit toward the front where I don't have to see behind me the rest of the room. But in a virtual conference, I have to see the whole Zoom room, where everyone is always visible, and that's even more exhausting. So I want us to get on the same page about the term equity, which is not the same as equality. I know some of you already know this, so just bear with me if you do. In case you don't, in this often shared visual, there are many variations out there, but in this one, we can see a baseball game representing any kind of event. There are 3 people who want to participate and who have a different number of boxes, or you might say tools with which to do so. Equality is giving each the participation tools in such a manner that lets everyone equality is giving each of these folks the same number of tools, whereas equity is distributing these participation tools in such a manner that lets everyone participate in the same way. So the visual does end with yet another term, wherein the fence or the systemic obstacle, whatever that may be, is dismantled. And we might call that liberation, as in the visual. We might also say justice, social justice, institutional justice, or as Federico has reminded me, emancipation. So how does this play out in WACWID work? On Wednesday, Pamela Flash and Teresa Red's mid-conference plenary showed through the illuminating live poll that they did during the plenary that 78% of us who attended and participated feel that the most urgent question or work of WAC scholar practitioners is, how can we best implement anti-racist policies and practices? So I'm making the assumption that knowing how to advocate for students' right to their own language, specific calls for WAC to be aware of linguistic difference, anti-racist writing assessment, and for linguistic justice are all administrative and pedagogical concerns that are pressing in our work today. The big question is, how do we do that? There's only so much I can say in this limited time. So what I want to focus on is actually for us to take a step back. One of the most common grievances I hear from WAC colleagues is that other academic units, and they're often business and STEM, but also just generally colleagues who don't train in language and writing, are bootstrapping standard language colonizers who refuse to acknowledge other Englishes in student writing, including but not limited to Black and other vernacular Englishes, various international student Englishes, and other US regional or working class Englishes. People just get really frustrated at this. But if you have this grievance, a big question I have for you is, who is doing this advocacy work? If this is what your WACWID programs, writing centers, other stakeholders look like, how effective is your message going to be? Over the course of the Breonna Taylor George Floyd culmination of summer 2020, we saw a lot of anti-racism popular books enter our collective consciousness. One of the authors, psychologist Beverly Daniel Tatum, who wrote Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria and Can We Talk About Race?, claims through studies that children learn exclusionary racism through the example of their parents. Ironically, the white parents she studied tell their children to integrate in schools, play with all the other kids, but they themselves only socialize with white friends. So it's a form of the old adage, do as I say, not as I do. And to me, this highlights the very human disconnect between our ideals and our actions, which, as smart and kind as we are, academics are not immune to. So here's a very simple heuristic I've developed, very, very simple, to help you decide whether or not you are ready to do linguistic equity work with colleagues across campus. Does my blank look, sound, and read like blank? And you can insert any of the appropriate variables depending on what the work is. For example, does my program, WACWID, writing, whatever, look, sound, and read like the student population I am advocating so hard for? Does my WACWID research project or initiative look, sound, and read like my country or region? And if you claim to be an international level institution, conference, organization, or journal, does it look, sound, and read like the world? If the answer is no, I think we need to step back. And I mean that not just for whatever individual programs or initiatives we have going on, but also for WAC itself. I invite you to look around the room. Do we really think we're ready to go out there and advocate for anti-racism, students' right to their own language, anti-racist assessment, and linguistic justice? So to take it back to, if I'm big, bad, linguistically ignorant business or STEM colleague, and the agents of change you send out to me are always white native English speakers looking, sounding, and reading like standard English, and you tell me to value linguistic difference, but your actions show otherwise, why should I believe a single word you have to say? Maybe we should work on equity at home first so that we can develop the ethos and integrity to go out there and do that advocacy work when we're ready. And so this might be an odd time to do this, but it's the most appropriate for me. And I'd like to thank Mike Palmquist and the conference committee for convening the three of us and making this space today.
Yeah. So when it comes to equity, as Al so clearly helped us understand, as distributing participation tools in such a manner that lets everyone participate in the same way, I keep returning to this question. Where are the access points into WAC? And I mean that on the level of where are the access points for upcoming WAC scholars, like graduate students? Where are the access points for scholars in different disciplines, like those in adjacent or even non-adjacent fields who are doing this work right outside of writing study, for faculty at our own institutions, for students at our institutions? Where are the thresholds, the crossover points, the paths in? Are they visible? Are they intentional? Are they equitable? Maybe that one will come up. Thinking about it. I'm starting to hate the term organic. We say we want things to happen organically or develop organically. And I do understand that sentiment, especially, and sometimes that is the right approach, especially when it's in opposition to like strong arming or taking over or moving too fast. But I think a lot of times things happening organically just means things happening under a cover of occlusion. Things happening for those people who are already in the know. In other words, I think it hides access points. Many are afraid that if we make things more formal, we lose a lot of flexibility. And I just don't think flexibility has to be the cost of formality. We can still be flexible while making the ways in visible. So as one example, the WAC graduate organization runs a cross-institutional mentoring program, which pairs more established scholar practitioners in WAC with graduate students or early career faculty at different institutions across an academic year. And I've seen so many people this week who have been part of that program. It was great to see you. Before we started this program, and even now when we do the intake survey each year, we see over and over graduate students saying that they don't have WAC mentors at their institution, or they don't know how to find them. We also hear established scholar practitioners saying that they want to learn from a new generation of WAC scholars and work with them, but they don't know where to find them. The formal program makes these connections possible. The mentoring relationships still grow and breathe and take different shapes organically, right? But the formal program creates a clear point of access. I had amazing mentors in grad school, WAC mentors, and it's why I'm here today, but it's because I got super lucky and I got shoulder tapped. That's not intentional, it's not equitable. But even beyond providing clear access points to promote equity, we then have to value it through reciprocity. So in the mentoring program, this means mentors learn just as much from their mentees as the other way around. And I'm actually going to quote at length from a study that we just did of the mentoring program from one of our mentors, and end this section with that because it doesn't really need further explanation. She said, my mentee is a person of color, and we've talked regularly about race and racism in academia in general and in our field. This has got me thinking about the importance of direct support of graduate students from minoritized groups, not just for those individuals, but for the field. If we truly want the diversity of our scholarly community to reflect the diversity of our communities and our schools, as I believe most of us really do, I think we need more of the kind of direct, sustained, personal mentoring the Cross-Institutional Mentoring Project is creating. This work does not show up in publication records. or in major named initiatives, but I believe it makes a difference, one scholar at a time, that will change our field as much as the big picture work of big name scholars will.
Thanks, Elisa and Al. I have been doing research on non-traditional students in Chilean universities. Until recently, enrollment in the university system in Chile was quite small, and only for a privileged minority. I am sharing with you some pictures of my students. They were not supposed to be there. Their university was not supposed to be there either. But there they are, and their university exists, because students in Chile are probably the most active agents of change in society. They do not lack agency. Those are the students speaking. On the contrary, the protests that you can see on the left helped create a massive program of free tuition and the first new public universities in around 80 years. I am proud to work for one of those universities. The image on the right, on the other hand, has led to the drafting of a new constitution, which is an ongoing process right now in Chile. Something important to consider is that so-called non-traditional students are traditional students now. They are the largest group of students in Chilean universities. In fact, very often, their universities, faculty, and pedagogy of writing seem at odds with current realities in higher education, as all pointed out earlier. So, what are the lessons learned from our research in Chile? Historically excluded students repeat and embody dominant deficit discourses, especially in the most competitive programs. But these negative self-perceptions contrast with their agency and resilience. They engage in complex but stigmatized or hidden vernacular practices and often receive dominant literacy practices. They deploy self-sponsored strategies which help them build bridges between their authorial identities and higher education tasks and requirements. And what are the pedagogical strategies we are putting forward? Recognize, validate, and make room for the vernacular practices students engage in. Design tasks that call for creativity and agency, that is, which involve research, perspectives, decisions, and engagement. Refer to meaningful, situated, and controversial topics related to social struggles or family and community histories, for example. Report critically and write parodies of received literacy practices, inviting recognition, but also resistance, negotiation, and transformation. Promote mixed genres and code meshing in the same text to train creative and sophisticated writers who can use their complex semiotic resources and talk and reflect on their choices. These are just a few research-based pedagogical insights, and you may well be more familiar with them than I am. But in any case, I think that the future of WAC could involve further exploring what an inclusive, anti-racist, socially just pedagogy of writing could be like. We know more about diversity and equity than how an equity-based pedagogy should look like. What you are seeing now is a picture in a literacy history written by a student of mine, Sofia, about her grandmother who dropped out of school in 3rd grade when her father found out that she was able to write. Enough schooling, her father said. And my student, the first in her family to attend higher education, heard this story during her research for this assignment when she interviewed her 87-year-old grandmother. So the future of WAC could involve exploring students' incomes, as Guerra puts it, through genres such as the literacy narrative, as recently advocated by Lindquist and Halbritter. It could also involve exploring anti-racist assessment practices, such as labor-based grading contracts developed by Inoue, not just to include or validate students' household and community practices, but to truly transform our teaching practices that seem to be a bit old-fashioned for what today's world demands. All this so that in such a way, we can help to promote social emancipation.
And so our last driving concept in looking towards the future of WAC is sustainability. This term has been invoked a lot throughout the week, starting as one of Chris Tice and Carol Rutz's main concepts in the opening plenary, and then as one of the major questions that came out of Pamela Flash and Teresa Red's fantastic survey in mid-plenary. It's a concept I think we all have a felt sense about, right? It describes something about lasting power, manageable growth, continuing across contextual and generational changes. But of course, how to actually invest in and build towards sustainability gets really complicated. So in Michelle Cox, Jeff Galen, and Dan Melzer's book, I should say now, award-winning book, they draw on no less than complexity theory, systems theory, social network theory, resilience theory, and sustainable development theory to propose their whole systems approach for launching and developing WAC programs. I say that to say there are a lot of factors that feed into sustainability, from sustaining the field as a whole, all the way down to sustaining the individual WAC initiatives at your institutions. I want to then just draw out one healthy tension that I think we'll have to wrestle with going forward when it comes to sustainability. And that's the tension between visibility and disappearance. So Cox, Galen, and Melzer describe visibility as the perception of a WAC program across its networks and projects, emphasizing that WAC tends towards stagnation and institutional entropy if program visibility is not a priority. At the programmatic level, this includes things like sponsored events, university-wide assessment, data sharing, program review, faculty support, student and faculty recognition, curriculum grants, and department-by-department planning. And gosh, we've seen so many sessions on these things this week that have been so good. At the level of the field, these moves toward visibility can be seen in, long-standing the WAC clearinghouse, our WAC journals, the IWAC conference, the formation of AWAC, and shameless plug, the WAC Summer Institute, which is a fall institute this year in October in Albuquerque. Registration opens August 15th. Yeah, I'm going to drop the link again, probably during the Q&A. We see so many of the points we've mentioned throughout this talk come to bear in how AWAC founders describe their purpose in establishing a formal, i.e. visible organization. So they write, a formal organization can, one, my Google slides are thinking about it today, provide codified structures for active membership in the WAC community. Two, ensure equitable pathways for scholarly and professional development in WAC. Three, establish procedures for cultivating new leadership. Four, envision and build new resources for the WAC community. And five, include faculty from WAC programs who would not likely have become involved without institutional membership opportunities. This is what I was talking about earlier about formality, right? That it leads to all of these things, and the visibility is part of what makes this possible. So this is crucial for sustainability. But a word on disappearance. So Rita Malinchek has a great piece called WAC's Disappearing Act, published almost 10 years ago now. She describes WAC as being gradually subsumed or dispersed into other disciplines or programmatic structures, and therefore being transformed into something other than what it was before. Something perhaps less obviously about writing alone. She doesn't see this as a failure, though. She sees it as a success, even a fulfillment of WAC, that faculty would embrace the movement so that it became simply part of the scene, with writing something they taught in each class and something they could write and publish about. She thus sees the disappearance of WAC as an opportunity for transformation. We can create all the programs and professional organizations in the world, and I'm for that, the visibility, for the formality, the division of labor, the collaboration, the equitable pathways. But these organizations have to be recreated constantly, because sometimes the fulfillment of goals is actually disappearance. Or maybe that disappearance is telling us that our original goals or structures are no longer responding to current needs. Chris Tice talked so well about this in the opening plenary in terms of adaptability. So for sustainability, there has to be constant reflection, constant renewal, constant recreation. And this can be done through like assessment, but I think what I'm envisioning is more than that. It's regularly inviting a lot of different voices to revisit and question even our most fundamental structures in our campus initiatives, in our programs, and our profession. Is this still working? How have the stakes changed? And then what's been done? What's been fulfilled? What goals have been reached where they can blend in and disappear to make room for what needs to happen now? In other words, when we look towards the future of WAC, I'm thinking that maybe visibility and disappearance aren't at complete odds, that for sustainability, we need the ability to do both, to carve out visibility when we need to, and to disappear when we need to, or at least to let pieces disappear. This is what gives us the ability to transform and shift our efforts of visibility so that we're meeting a constantly changing landscape.
Thanks, Alisa. I will refer now to a very specific aspect of WAC sustainability, research. Research that we can use tactically, as Adler-Gassner would put it, to convince stakeholders, to fight for funding, to influence educational policies, to reach an academic position, or to engage in international conversations, like those I mentioned before. You can see on your screen 2 WAC awarded books related to research. But we face a challenge. Many of those stakeholders, policymakers, employers, and international colleagues do not care too much about our books and book chapters, but expect and even demand that we also publish our research in index journals, especially those indexed in databases such as Web of Science or Scopus. So in a way, WAC sustainability depends on the existence of such index journals where we can publish and distribute our research. But the truth is, there are not many such journals. If you compare them to other related fields such as sociolinguistics, second language teaching, or higher education studies, you may say that there are good reasons for this configuration. You may say that index journals respond to a different epistemology, to a different knowledge-making culture, and also to a different rhetoric of knowledge-making. From this point of view, index journals belong to a positivist epistemology, to quantitative approaches, and to a relative lack of theoretical depth, which may be common in other areas such as STEM, as I'll explain before. Moreover, Scopus or Web of Science are for-profit, neglect languages other than English, and measure scientific relevance in very controversial ways. So they are quite colonial, if you think about it. However, indexation does not mean indexation in a particular way. It just means that a certain journal complies with certain quality and integrity standards, which is an indication of good research. But the criteria for indexation may vary. So our fight should be about certain criteria for indexation instead of against indexation. Let me refer to an example, Cielo, which means sky in Spanish. Cielo stands for Scientific Electronic Library Online. And in short, it is a cooperative, not-for-profit, multilingual, open access, South-based bibliographic database. It was created in Brazil in 1997 and now includes 17 countries, many of them from Latin America, together with South Africa, Spain, and Portugal. It lists currently over 870,000 records. It is free to publish and download any record, and your journal needs to be open access to be indexed. But it is not just a repository of open access papers published in the Southern Hemisphere and written in many languages. It is quite difficult to get indexed in Cielo, as you have to comply with standards that are common to many other databases, such as double-blind peer review or periodicity. The meaningful contribution of Cielo is just the opposite. Good, socially responsible science has to comply with quality standards and needs to be open access and not for profit. This scientific perspective may resonate with WAC scholars and practitioners, as it is quite similar to many WAC initiatives, such as the clearinghouse journals Alisa mentioned before. So my point is that the future of WAC could involve paving the way for index journals, which can engage in conversations with stakeholders that demand research articles to sustain our educational claims programs and policies, but at the same time, to fight for certain alternative criteria for indexation, which promote free access and democratization of knowledge, together, of course, with multiple languages, approaches, and epistemologies.
Thank you, Alisa and Federico. I want to dovetail from what they're talking about in terms of sustainability. Alisa's reference to the Cox-Gale and Meltzer work on sustainable WAC and Federico's deconstruction of the research and publication processes, both of which are very comprehensive in looking at institutional structures and systems. We're also good, very good at making the subject of our work the students we teach and the content colleagues we reach out to. But we rarely think and talk about ourselves. And I'm not sure why, and if that's maybe part of the STEMification or empiricization of writing studies, this hesitance to acknowledge the subjective. So I'm thinking about the agentic human behind these processes, directors, coordinators, with teachers, instructors, etc. And I'm asking the question, what is our role? I'm again borrowing from writing center discourse, specifically Elizabeth Cowan's many hats metaphor for that writing center directors and tutors wear, contextually, depending on with whom they are interacting. And also from Shirley Rose and Erwin Weiser's works on the roles of administrators as researcher and the follow-up as theorist. All to pose that WACWID agents too need to be limber in the roles that we inhabit. So to build and maintain more sustainable relationships, I think one, we need to maintain a high level of self-awareness of ourselves, hence the question, what is our role? And two, if, as I mentioned earlier, the many groups and units we interact with on campus all hold different cultures and maintain different values on education and language. One role may be as anthropologists to better understand these differences. But once we do understand those differences, what then? Are we missionaries? If so, what kind? The kind that goes around campus and knocks on all colleagues' doors at 8 a.m. In the morning to spread the gospels of Baker Bell and Inouye and Kennard? Are we politicians? If so, what kind? Are we colonizers and invaders? Should we be aggressive in liberating students who are writing in other fields? Are we doing a kind of Operation STEM Freedom? Or do we subtly spread out cultural values like Hollywood does, which itself is a form of neo-colonization? And I'm thinking of how WACWID is at the borders of writing studies. So are we then border patrol agents? And who keep migrants from entering our field? And if they do enter, what ways are we deporting them, caging them up, or giving them water and nourishment so that they help rejuvenate our field intellectually. I also heard in a Wednesday session on cross-disciplinary collaboration, Maureen Matheson distinguishing WAC practitioners as tourist versus sojourner, the latter of which is more thoughtful in their movement and travels. So the point I want to make here is that to extend the metaphor, to build and maintain sustainable WAC relationships on campus, just like any cross-cultural or multilateral international relationships, there isn't one template approach of what role we inhabit, but that we need to be more mindful, deliberate, and kairotic of the roles that we do embody and move between. Okay, so ultimately, we don't have an in conclusion for you here. At this point, we don't want you to feel a sense of finality for how these ideas factor into our WAC futures. Instead, we want all of us, the field, the journals, the organizations, all the scholar, teacher, practitioners, to forge ahead and explore all these questions and the ideas we've presented to see where it takes you. We're not looking to close things, but to open them.
Yeah, so in that spirit, I'm actually going to, in a minute, I'm going to drop a link to this Google Doc. We want to turn all of these thoughts, we've just kind of dropped a lot of things on you. And I feel like this whole week has been a lot of generating questions, especially coming out of that mid-plenary, right? Those were your questions you generated in the survey that Pamela and Teresa so thoughtfully, coded and put together. And so we want to crowdsource and turn this. We do want to take your questions. We were unsure how chatty people would be at this point of the conference. If you're feeling the little dip, your drinks and your naps are calling you. So we do want to go into a Q&A, absolutely. If you have questions, comments, we want to hear from you. But we really want to turn your attention to this collective action plan. And we've even included the mid-plenary questions from Wednesday. What are the answers to these questions? What does it look like to put these into action? And so this is an editable document. We've started based on our talk and the things that we've been thinking about. We've started adding some items. I encourage you to add items and then add comments, either on your own item to further explain it, or to ask questions, right? Like I wrote this one, but I'm wanting examples, right? And for this to be a space where we really start, if we're thinking towards the future, what does it actually look like? Because we want to have a cacophonous kind of future, not a monolithic one. We want something born of our collective experience. I'm going to stop my share and drop this in the chat.
So we look forward to hearing and reading your questions and ideas. Thank you very much.
Thank you for a great talk. That was really gave us a lot to think about. Caleb, I'm wondering if you might be able to take a look at the questions that might come up in the chat, and or perhaps people could simply unmute themselves and ask questions. That might be the simplest thing to do. But we'll go forward on both fronts.
And I think Jeff has his hand up. Jeff, if you want to get us going.
Thanks for that talk. It was interesting, provocative. I like having ideas thrown on the table that have been swirling around in the conference, and I've gone to as much of the conference as I could, but without trying to forestall what the directions or future answers to those questions might be. I really like this focus. A lot of things struck me about the presentation, but one of the things that I focused on was that this idea of invisibility and visibility. And it occurred to me that there is, so this is a comment and then a question to the group. It occurred to me that WAC discourse shifts from an emergent discourse to a dominant discourse when the visibility of the program tends to become lower, when invisibility becomes the process, right? So because you're incorporating, you're making dominant the practice. That process in and of itself is both a success and also a problem, because questions stop being asked, and I mean it's how dominant discourse works, and how the way in which I guess Gerald Graff, who talks about exploring the controversies in a field, gets stopped unless someone begins to re-ask those questions. So I guess my question is, when you think about visibility and invisibility in the field, how should we react, for example, when our assessments then become distributed and no longer involve us as directors, or and then either evolve or devolve into something different? How should we think about this question of invisibility with, I guess, a range of courses that get certified as WAC or WID courses and then don't get recertified again in the future? So there's my question.
Yeah, it's a good question. That is the tension, isn't it? And I wonder, I think that's why I'm thinking so much about recreation, because there's a real tension there too of, we don't want to constantly be reinventing the wheel, but I almost wonder, part of me almost wonders if we have to a little bit. At Mason, our WI courses were, they had to be reevaluated like every 3 years. I think they had to resubmit things. And even that process got so, just got more and more rote, to where everyone was doing their WI courses. And then when we stopped and we did a big study, let's interview faculty, let's actually see what's happening here. And we actually realized that a lot of our processes weren't bad. They had just become so, like you said, they had become so stilted, I guess, and you didn't say that, I'm sorry, but just so dominant, right? That it was really checking off boxes and not really doing anything. And what ended up happening, we kind of ended up keeping a lot of the same structures, but doing some renewal and redoing. And so doing it a little bit differently, and pairing it with some different things. And so it got kind of rebooted a little bit. And I'm always thinking about that tension of the reboot versus the kind of sustainable going. And if you kind of need both. Yeah, something I'm still thinking through for sure. Be interested in others' thoughts on this, panelists and otherwise.
I'm thinking, Jeff, along more kind of systemic lines and academic cultural lines, in terms of writing studies as legitimization project, because, so for example, at Arizona, which when I was there had no WAC program proper, but the provost office was trying to do something, and the writing center was trying to do something, and various student support services was trying to do something, and it was just this patchwork of WAC-like looking work, and so I wonder how much we need to lean in and say, no, writing studies is a legitimate field, and that's a much bigger problem. But I think we in WAC tend to be more lax with that, because we want the field to be more porous, right? We want it to be welcoming. But then I'm wondering if we can't have it both ways then. Yeah, I don't know. That's a great question.
Joanna, do you have another question to take us into more thoughts?
Thanks. It's actually an extension of the last one, or just thinking, I think it's really, I'm the WAC director of what's not officially called a WAC program. I'm a WPA. We've had a lot of students. I'm at the University of Miami, so it's a pretty diverse institution. We've had a lot of students coming in this semester. We're completely overbooked, overwhelmed. I've been trying to hire faculty. I've been trying to hire graduate students. And the reality is the people that are applying for the jobs are not the people that I want to hire that can do this kind of work, or that I would want to be able to do this kind of work. The graduate students that are in our program are in a different department. They're in the English department, so we inherit those graduate students. We don't get to choose who they are. All of this to say, or beginning to say, is that the work that I think we need to be doing, which you have wonderfully and brilliantly exposed for us today, and continued this conversation. I think we need to really go back to grassroots and to think about who our undergraduate students are, and to how we can get people interested in our field who are in the undergraduate world. Because already by the time they're graduate students, those people are not coming through. How can we tap into future scholars who are currently 18 and 19 years old? How can we find those people look at us all here on this Zoom call. Most of us look a certain way, and when we need to make sure that the people coming through are much more diverse, and we're going to be a different kind of group. But it's very difficult to do that work when those people just aren't being encouraged, or for very good reasons oftentimes. But I think we need to work even further back and think about things even further back about how we can encourage people to get into our field much earlier on than we even do now.
Yeah, Cameron, please.
Hey, Lisa. Thanks so much for a wonderful talk, all of you, Al and Federico. It was really lovely. I think on our campus and maybe on others, one untapped resource is international graduate students. We often don't think of them as writing resources. We think of them as those that need assistance. And I'm not saying that they don't. But on the other hand, they have a way of approaching writing, which is that it is a translation, or it is a struggle, or it is an effort, a labor. Horner and Tétrault write about this. All writing is also translation. And I do believe that some of the issues, or an avenue into addressing some of the issues of coloniality and other social justice issues that you were talking about might be through tapping our international graduate students as more as writing resources than we do currently. Just and something that I've been thinking about on our campus. Sorry, I perhaps should have asked a question. Maybe it should be more as how could, sorry, I sort of shut off conversation. I didn't mean to do that, but how could maybe, is this something on your campuses that you might think of as an additional way in, if you will? Let me say that.
To Al's point a little bit earlier, we have to, if we're going to address the stemmatization of writing studies, then we may need to very much learn from how our students are addressing colonialism in our classrooms. And I don't want to equate the two in the sense that they're in the same struggle, because they're definitely not the same struggle. But I think we can, what I'm trying to say is we can learn from the things that were listed in and discussed in this plenary session in terms of how we operate through WAC. And so I thought perhaps that was implied in some of these things that you guys were making, the speakers were making in the plenary session. I think that I came to that thought as a result of what I heard in the sessions. So I'm thinking that perhaps it was implied. So that was really, I guess maybe the question was it implied? I think it probably was, but you guys don't have to answer that if you don't feel like it.
I suspect you guys are still thinking about these questions and trying to, it's always hard to think on your feet. I'm going to throw out another question, and you can circle back once you've had a chance to think about the questions that Diane and Cameron have asked. Maybe you want to come back to that. But I really want to ask a question right now. You've spent a lot of time thinking about these issues. You've looked at the challenges we're facing as a group. What would each of you think is the single first step that should be taken? What's the most important thing you would want to do, each one of you? And maybe briefly why that would be the step you'd want to take.
Three of us made a specific point or step forward for each of the concepts. Maybe this is more of a personal answer. Lately, I've been thinking a lot about how an equity-based pedagogy for writing should look like. Because sometimes I have the feeling that many of the authors, scholars, and research that are more inspiring for me, for example, in Latin America, Virginia Zavala, you may be familiar with her. They do great research. They do research that is oriented towards linguistic justice and inclusion and equity, but they stop there. They explicitly say, you know, I'm not into how to transform this into a pedagogy of writing. Whereas others who are in the classroom sometimes have a different take on that because they are actually teaching writing to different profiles of students. So something similar happens to, I think, to the research sometimes that comes from new literacy studies, which is also very influential to me. So I'm wondering if we can connect these different traditions, right? And to make use of all we know about equity, inclusion, social injustice, linguistic injustice, to think again about our pedagogies of writing. At least this is a discussion that is taking place in Latin America right now. But sometimes I have the feeling that this discussion is repeated in many places, around the world. Of course, in different ways because the traditions and the histories of the field are different, right? But sometimes I have the feeling that these two traditions, one that is more research-based and another one that is more connected to practitioners, do not build bridges too often. So that would be my first step. Right, to think about that.
Thanks, Federico. Al or Elisa?
Yeah.
Can you repeat the question, please?
Sure. You've laid out all kinds of directions in which we could move, directions that we should move. If you had to pick one, what would it as a first step? Because obviously we want to do all of them. But if you had to pick one as a first step, what would it be, and briefly why? Would that be your first one? So it might be strategic, it might be theoretical, it might be philosophical, it might be practical.
Yeah, I keep, Cameron, I'm really like chewing on your comment because of the way you phrased it. It's why aren't we look as if we're always thinking about helping international students when they actually have so much to offer our discipline and our programs, right? So I just keep coming back to reciprocity. I keep coming back to what does it really mean for our WAC work, really at every level, but I'm thinking at the most basic levels to be a give and take, and not take in a bad way, but I think there is, I think there's more work to be done in that two-wayness, I guess. Just thinking of something as simple as the other day, I met with an engineering faculty member to discuss how to integrate peer review into her classroom. And what does it mean in that discussion, right, in that little conference, to how can I frame things and how can I actually invite her ideas back into my work and make that a more reciprocal exchange, is maybe where what I'm thinking is a really, really important place that all of us need to think more about those paths of reciprocity in our work.
That's great. And Al, before you respond to that question, I want to remind everybody that we're going to be running up against our 1:30 or 3:30 or 12:30 or whatever 30 deadline for the end of this thing. So you'll get the last word, and then I'd like to briefly wrap things up. So Al, have at it.
You know, that is a nightmare question for me, Mike, because I'm a big fan of diversity of tactics. So, you know, I'm always thinking that for anything to happen, there's a team and one person needs to focus on this while the other focuses on that. And you know, something like if we're working on labor, then yeah, it's great that there are unions out there burning things down, but we have folks like Seth Khan on the inside. So it's the one thing you would do question is always difficult for me. Because even everything that we've talked about today, even if we say it's cacophonous, you know, they all have to work in concert, right? Like the legitimization of WAC, the visibility of WAC, that all goes together with the diversification and all the equity stuff. I think that's the question we should focus on, Mike. I think the first thing we need to do is ask ourselves, what is the first thing we need to do? Sorry, is that a cop-out? I think it's great.
I think it's a sophisticated answer to a tough question. I mean, I'm completely with you that we all have to move forward in multiple ways. Some people are going to be focusing on quite different issues, but together collectively we can have a real difference. So recognizing the time, I want to do two things. I want to thank everybody for coming here and spending the week with us and just being such great members of this community. I really appreciate it. And then I want to ask us all to thank our plenary speakers for a really engaging and exciting presentation and something that will give us things to take forward with. I mean, the comments in the chat, I hope you all have a chance to look at them. They're wonderful, but perhaps we could all unmute and give our speakers the round of applause they deserve. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you very
everybody.
much.
Really appreciate it, everybody.